At first, everyone thought the dog was dragging trash. Then the blanket took a breath. Rain had been falling over Market Street since dawn, turning the pavement silver and pushing cold water along the gutters in narrow streams. Cars moved slowly through the intersection, tires whispering over wet asphalt, horns sounding whenever traffic hesitated. That was when Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes saw the German Shepherd step between two parked vehicles with a gray blanket clenched between her teeth. She was lean beneath her black and tan coat, her paws dark with mud, her amber eyes fixed on the far side of the street. The blanket dragged behind her, heavy enough to pull her shoulders low. Every few feet, she stopped, adjusted her grip, and pulled again. A delivery driver leaned on his horn. Someone shouted from a storefront. The dog did not flinch. Daniel stood beneath the awning of his repair shop, one hand still holding a metal travel mug. He was 42, broad-shouldered, white, with short dark brown hair and gray-blue eyes that had spent years reading distance, movement, and danger before other people noticed them. He watched the dog cross one lane, then another. Something about the way she moved held him still. She was not wandering. She was working. A sedan slowed too late, and Daniel stepped into the street with one arm raised. "Stop." The driver braked, more surprised by Daniel than by the dog. He moved forward, keeping his body between traffic and the German Shepherd. Up close, the blanket looked old but carefully gathered, its corners folded inward as though something had been wrapped inside. Rain had soaked the outer layer, yet the center remained raised from the ground. The dog reached the curb in front of Daniel's shop and released the fabric. Her breath came fast. She looked at Daniel, then down at the blanket. Daniel crouched several feet away. "Easy, girl." The German Shepherd did not retreat. She planted herself beside the gray bundle, ears forward, body trembling from effort rather than fear. Daniel set the travel mug aside and extended one empty hand. Her nose moved toward him, catching his scent through the rain. For 1 second, her eyes softened. Then the blanket shifted. Not from the wind, not from the water running beneath it. The fabric near the center rose slightly, paused, and lowered again. Daniel's chest tightened. Around them, the street began to quiet. A woman under a red umbrella stopped walking. 2 mechanics stepped out from the garage bay. The driver who had honked rolled down his window, but said nothing. Daniel moved closer by inches. The dog watched every motion. "What did you bring me?" he whispered. Her gaze dropped to the bundle. Daniel reached for one wet corner, but before his fingers touched it, the German Shepherd placed one paw over the blanket. Not a threat, a warning to be careful. Daniel looked at her, then at the raised shape beneath the cloth. A faint sound came from inside. Soft, unsteady, almost lost beneath the rain. He leaned closer. The sound came again. This time, everyone nearby heard it. The woman with the umbrella covered her mouth. One of the mechanics took a step forward, then stopped. Daniel slowly removed his jacket and laid it beside the blanket, creating a dry place on the sidewalk. The dog studied him. Rain gathered along the edges of her ears and ran down her muzzle. "I am going to help," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, as if weighing the promise. Then she lifted her paw. Daniel touched the blanket. Warmth still lived beneath the soaked fabric. He began to open the first fold, and the German Shepherd turned toward the street behind them, searching the way she had come. Whatever was inside the blanket was only part of the story, and the dog was not finished leading him. 30 minutes earlier, Daniel Hayes had been alone inside the repair shop, listening to rain strike the corrugated metal roof above the service base. The morning had begun like most of his mornings did. He unlocked the side door before sunrise, brewed coffee strong enough to taste bitter through the steam, and turned on the old radio without raising the volume. Outside, Market Street slowly came to life beneath gray clouds. Delivery trucks backed toward loading docks. Store owners lifted metal shutters. A city bus side at the corner and moved on. Daniel checked tire pressure, replaced a worn belt, and wrote an estimate for a woman whose sedan had begun making a sharp sound near the front wheel. He was good at finding what was wrong when the problem could be touched, measured, or heard. People were harder. People could hide damage behind ordinary words. Daniel had learned that long before leaving the Marine Corps. At 42, he still carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who noticed every entrance and remembered every face. Yet most customers only saw a dependable mechanic in an olive work jacket, with short dark brown hair, gray-blue eyes, and hands marked by years of tools and weather. They did not see how carefully he kept his life arranged to avoid surprises. He lived in a narrow brick house 10 minutes from the shop. One bedroom, one coffee cup beside the sink, one porch light that came on each evening whether anyone was expected or not. On the desk in his office sat an unopened envelope addressed in a child's careful handwriting. It had arrived 3 weeks earlier from Jacksonville. The return name was Ethan Parker. Daniel knew the last name before he touched it. He had placed the envelope beneath a service manual and left it there. 8 years had passed since Ethan's father, Sergeant Michael Parker, had been lost during Daniel's final deployment. Daniel had attended the memorial, stood beside the family, and promised he would stay in touch. At first, he did. Birthday cards, holiday calls, a visit one summer. Then the calls became harder. Every conversation reminded him of the man who should have been making them. Daniel convinced himself that distance was kinder than showing up with nothing useful to say. The envelope on his desk suggested the family had not agreed. A bell sounded above the front entrance. Daniel looked up, expecting a customer, but no one entered. Through the rain-streaked glass, he saw a German shepherd standing outside the laundromat across the street. She was soaked, thin, and focused on a rolling donation bin near the curb. The bin held old coats, towels, and folded blankets beneath a plastic cover. A laundromat employee stepped outside and waved his arms. "Go on. Leave it." The dog backed away, but only until the man returned inside. Then she approached again. She rose on her hind legs, caught the corner of a gray blanket in her teeth, and pulled. The blanket fell from the bin, spreading across the wet sidewalk. Daniel watched her gather the fabric with surprising care. She did not shake it or tear it. She folded part of it inward with her paws, gripped the thickest edge, and began dragging it toward the alley beside an empty row house. One of Daniel's mechanics glanced through the bay door. "Looks like she found herself a bed." Daniel did not answer. The dog paused at the mouth of the alley and looked back toward the laundromat. Then she looked across the street at Daniel. Their eyes met through the rain. She held the blanket in her mouth for several seconds before disappearing between the buildings. Daniel felt something old stir beneath his practiced distance. Not alarm. Recognition. The look had not asked for food or shelter. It had asked him to pay attention. He removed the envelope from beneath the service manual and placed it in his jacket pocket without opening it. Then he stepped outside, just as the German shepherd emerged from the alley again, pulling the blanket behind her with far more weight inside it than before. Daniel stopped before opening the next fold. The German shepherd had turned toward the alley, but she did not leave. She took 3 steps into the rain, looked back at him, then returned to the blanket. Her message was divided between 2 places. Something needed help here. Something else had happened behind her. Daniel raised one hand toward the mechanics standing beneath the shop awning. "Call emergency services. Tell them we have a child or small person under a blanket, breathing but unresponsive." The older mechanic, Luis, reached for his phone at once. Daniel looked at the woman with the red umbrella. "Please stay beside the blanket. Do not move it unless the breathing changes." She nodded and lowered herself near the curb, holding the umbrella over the soaked fabric. The dog watched Daniel until he stood. Then she moved toward the alley again, slowly enough for him to follow. Rainwater ran along the brick walls and gathered around broken pieces of pavement. The passage smelled of damp wood, laundry soap, and old dust. Daniel kept the dog within sight as she led him no more than 50 yards behind the row houses. She stopped beside a small blue sneaker lying on its side near a drain. Daniel picked it up. Child size. Mud stained the heel, and one lace was missing. Farther ahead, a white plastic cap rested beneath a fire escape. Daniel crouched and turned it over. It belonged to an asthma inhaler. The dog touched it with her nose, then looked toward the abandoned house at the end of the alley. Daniel followed her gaze. One window had been covered with plywood. The back door stood partly open, moving slightly in the wind. Across the wet ground, long marks ran from that doorway toward the street. 2 parallel lines. Something had been dragged carefully over the mud. Daniel looked at the German shepherd. Her chest rose and fell quickly. The fur along her neck was wet, but beneath the rain he could see dust and pale fibers clinging to her coat. Fibers from the gray blanket. "You went inside," he said. She turned toward the open doorway, walked several feet, and stopped. Daniel approached, but did not enter. Through the narrow opening, He saw an empty front room, scattered cardboard, and a second gray blanket lying near the wall. On the floor beside it sat an orange inhaler canister and a folded piece of paper sealed inside a clear plastic bag. Daniel reached through the doorway and picked up the bag. Written across the front in blue ink were two words that stopped him cold. Daniel Hayes. The handwriting was not the same as the envelope in his pocket. This writing belonged to an adult. Older, firm, familiar. He had seen it on field notes, birthday cards, and equipment labels 8 years ago. Michael Parker. The rain seemed to disappear for one suspended second. Daniel stared at the name while the dog moved back toward the alley. She looked at him, then at the street, urgent now. The breathing person beneath the blanket was connected to the letter. Connected to Michael. Daniel placed the sealed note inside his jacket and followed her back. As they reached Market Street, a distant siren began to rise above the sound of rain. The crowd had grown, but no one spoke loudly. The woman with the umbrella remained beside the bundle. Louise stood in the roadway, directing cars around the curb. Daniel knelt again. The German Shepherd took her place opposite him, close enough that her front paws touched the edge of the blanket. Daniel placed the small blue sneaker beside the bundle. The dog lowered her head and pressed her nose against it. "I know where you brought them from," Daniel said softly. Her amber eyes lifted to his. "Now let me see who you carried." He opened the first layer. Beneath it lay a child's navy jacket, carefully wrapped around the smaller shape inside. A faded family photograph rested against the fabric. Daniel saw Michael Parker smiling beside a woman and a young boy. His hand stopped. The boy in the photograph looked about 6 years old. The child beneath the blanket was older now. The German Shepherd nudged Daniel's wrist. Not hard, just enough. He unfolded the jacket, and a small hand appeared, holding a military dog tag so tightly that the chain had left a pale mark across the fingers. Daniel recognized the name before he could read it. The street fell completely silent. Daniel's hand remained beneath the fold of the blanket as the siren drew closer. The child's fingers were wrapped around Michael Parker's dog tag with the stubborn grip of someone who had refused to let go of the only familiar thing left. Daniel leaned near the boy's face. His breathing was shallow, uneven, but present. "Ethan," Daniel said, barely above a whisper. The German Shepherd's ears lifted at the name. The boy's eyelids moved, though they did not open. Daniel looked across the bundle and met the dog's amber eyes. "You brought him all this way." She lowered her head beside Ethan's shoulder, close enough to feel each breath. Officer Rachel Monroe arrived first, stepping from her patrol vehicle with a medical bag while emergency technicians moved through the crowd behind her. Daniel raised one hand before anyone touched the blanket. "He has asthma. His inhaler may be empty. He has been exposed to the cold and rain." Rachel knelt beside him. "How long?" "I do not know." The German Shepherd shifted closer when one technician approached. Daniel placed his palm against the pavement between them. "Easy. They are here to help him." The dog washed his face, then stepped back one pace. It was permission, not surrender. The technicians opened the blanket only as far as necessary, preserving the warmth trapped inside. Beneath the navy jacket, Ethan wore a gray sweatshirt darkened by rain at the cuffs. His skin was pale from the cold, but his chest continued to rise. One technician fitted a small oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. Another checked the inhaler canister and shook his head. Empty. Daniel stayed beside Ethan while they worked. Around them, Market Street had become strangely still. Engines idled without horns. Store doors stood open. People watched from sidewalks, not with curiosity now, but with the quiet respect given to something fragile. Rachel picked up the family photograph and held it near Daniel. "You know them?" Daniel looked at Michael's face in the picture. Younger than Daniel remembered him, smiling in sunlight with one hand on Ethan's shoulder and the other around his wife. "I knew his father." Rachel glanced at the dog tag. "Military." Daniel nodded. "Marine." The word felt heavier than it had in years. One of the technicians looked up. "The boy is responding." Ethan's eyes opened briefly. They moved without focus until they found the German Shepherd. His hand loosened around the chain. "Sadie?" He breathed through the mask. The dog stepped forward at once, placing her nose near his fingertips. Her tail moved once against the wet pavement. Daniel felt the name settle into the moment. "Sadie." Ethan looked beyond her and found Daniel. Confusion passed across his face, followed by something like recognition. "Mr. Hayes." Daniel went still. Yes. Ethan tried to speak again, but the technician asked him to save his breath. The boy lifted the dog tag slightly, then turned his eyes toward Daniel's jacket pocket, where the sealed note rested. Daniel understood. He removed the plastic bag and held it where Ethan could see. I found it. Ethan's eyes closed, not from fear this time, but relief. The technicians moved him onto a stretcher, keeping the blanket around him. Sadie followed until the rear doors of the ambulance. When they began to close, she tried to step inside. Rachel looked at Daniel. Can you keep her calm? Daniel placed one hand gently along Sadie's shoulder. She goes with him. The technician hesitated, then made room near Ethan's feet. Sadie climbed inside and lay down without being told, her body curved toward the boy. Just before the doors shut, Ethan's hand slipped from beneath the blanket and rested against her fur. Daniel stood in the rain holding Michael's unopened letter. Rachel turned toward him. Are you coming? He looked at the ambulance, then back at the quiet street. 8 years of distance had led to this curb, this dog, this child, and a message he had been afraid to read. Daniel stepped forward. Yes, he said. This time, I am coming. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic, rainwater, and coffee that had been sitting too long beneath fluorescent lights. Daniel stood near the entrance with Michael's letter inside his jacket, while Ethan was taken behind a set of double doors. Sadie remained beside him, wet fur pressed against his leg, eyes fixed on the hallway where the stretcher had disappeared. A nurse brought a towel and offered it carefully. Daniel dried the dog's back, then her ears, but Sadie never looked away from the doors. Officer Rachel Monroe finished speaking with hospital security and returned with Ethan's Navy jacket, the family photograph, and the empty inhaler sealed inside a clear bag. They reached his mother, she said. She is driving from Jacksonville. Daniel looked toward the rain sliding down the windows. That is more than an hour away. She was already on the road. She reported him missing early this morning. Rachel sat across from him. She said he left home with Sadie before dawn. Daniel felt the unopened envelope in his pocket, the one Ethan had mailed 3 weeks earlier. Why would he come here alone? Rachel studied him. That is what everyone wants to know. Sadie suddenly stood. A young doctor had entered the waiting area, removing a mask from her face. Daniel Hayes. He stepped forward. Yes. Ethan is stable. His breathing has improved, and his temperature is rising. He will need observation, but he is awake. The words loosened something in Daniel's chest. Sadie moved toward the doctor, then stopped when Daniel touched her shoulder. Can she see him? He asked. The doctor glanced at the soaked German shepherd. For a minute. Keep her calm. Daniel almost smiled. She has been calmer than the rest of us. Ethan lay beneath warm blankets in a private room, color slowly returning to his face. A monitor sounded softly beside the bed. When Sadie entered, his tired eyes opened wider. She crossed the room without hesitation and placed her chin near his hand. Ethan touched the fur between her ears. Good girl, he whispered. Daniel remained near the door. He had imagined meeting Michael's son again many times, but never like this. Never with 8 years between them and a military dog tag resting on a hospital tray. Ethan looked at him. You got my letter? Daniel removed the unopened envelope from his pocket. I did. The boy's expression fell. You did not read it. It was not a question. Daniel looked down at the handwriting. No. Ethan turned his face towards Sadie. Mom said you might not answer. The words carried no anger. That made them harder to hear. Why did you come to Wilmington? Daniel asked. Ethan drew a careful breath. Because the other letter came back. Daniel glanced toward the sealed plastic bag inside his jacket. The one from your father? Ethan nodded. Mom found it in a box from the Marine Corps. It had your name on it. She said she would mail it, but she kept waiting. So you brought it yourself. I thought if you saw me, you would have to listen. Daniel closed his eyes for 1 second. Not because the words were cruel, but because they were true. Ethan explained that he and Sadie had taken a bus north with money saved from birthdays. They reached Market Street after sunrise, but the rain worsened and his inhaler began to fail. He entered the empty row house to get dry. When he could no longer walk, Sadie stayed beside him. She left for a while, Ethan said. Then she came back with the blanket. Daniel looked at the dog. She brought it from the laundromat. Ethan nodded. She kept pulling it around me. Then she grabbed the end and would not stop. The room became quiet except for the monitor. Sadie had dragged the boy from the cold house, through the alley, and toward the busiest street she could find. She had not known Daniel's name. She had only known that people meant a chance. The door opened, and a woman entered with rain on her coat and fear still visible in her eyes. Laura Parker saw Ethan, then Sadie, then Daniel. She stopped as if all three belonged to different parts of a life she had struggled to hold together. Daniel reached into his jacket and placed Michael's sealed letter on the table between them. Laura looked at it, then at him. "He wrote that for you 8 years ago," she said. Daniel rested his hand beside the envelope. "Then I have been late long enough." Laura stood beside Ethan's bed while Daniel opened the plastic bag and removed the letter. The paper inside had softened along the folds with age, but Michael's handwriting remained steady. Sadie lay beneath the window, her head resting on her paws, watching the room as if she understood that the next few minutes mattered. Daniel unfolded the letter carefully. The first line was simple. "Daniel, if this reaches you, then I am trusting you with the part of my life I cannot carry home." Daniel stopped reading. The hospital room seemed to narrow around the words. Laura lowered herself into the chair beside Ethan. "He wrote it before his last deployment," she said. "The box arrived months later, but this letter was sealed inside a field notebook. I did not find it until this winter." Daniel looked at her. "Why did you wait?" Laura pressed both hands together. "Because you disappeared from our lives. I did not know whether sending it would help or reopen everything." Ethan watched Daniel from the bed. "I thought he would want you to have it." Daniel looked back at the page. Michael wrote about ordinary things first. Ethan learning to ride a bicycle. Laura burning pancakes and laughing about it. Sadie still being a young dog who stole socks and hid them beneath the couch. Then the words changed. "If I do not make it back, do not become a ghost because you think grief is loyalty. Laura and Ethan will need people who remember me, but they will also need someone who sees them as they are now. Stay close. Not because you owe me, because you know what it means when someone is left standing alone." Daniel's hands began to tremble. He had expected a request, a duty, something he could have failed clearly. Instead, Michael had asked him not to disappear, and Daniel had done exactly that. He continued reading. There was no accusation in the letter, only trust. Michael told him to teach Ethan how to change a tire when he was old enough, to remind Laura that asking for help was not weakness, to keep an eye on Sadie because she had more courage than sense. At that, Ethan smiled faintly. Daniel looked toward the German shepherd. Sadie lifted her head. "He knew her," Ethan said. "She was a puppy when Dad left." Laura nodded. "Michael trained her to find Ethan when he hid in the yard. He turned it into a game." Daniel looked at the soaked blanket folded over the chair. She never forgot. The doctor entered quietly and checked Ethan's breathing. His color had improved, and the tightness in his chest had eased. "He should recover fully," she said. "Another night for observation, then home if everything remains stable." Laura thanked her, but Daniel heard only the final lines of the letter. "If you are reading this years from now, do not waste time punishing yourself for being late. Open the door anyway." Daniel lowered the page. For 8 years, he had told himself that staying away protected Michael's family from his silence, his memories, and the parts of him that never returned from service. The truth was less noble. He had been afraid they would remind him how deeply he still cared. Ethan looked at him. "Are you angry?" "At you?" Daniel asked. Ethan nodded. "For coming here." Daniel moved closer to the bed. "No, I am sorry you thought you had to." Laura's eyes filled, but she did not look away. Daniel placed the letter beside Michael's dog tag. "I cannot fix the years I missed." His voice was quiet, but certain. "I can stop missing the ones ahead." Ethan studied him, searching for something dependable. Sadie rose and stepped between them, pressing her shoulder against Daniel's leg while keeping her nose near Ethan's hand. Laura rested one palm on the blanket. "Then start by staying until morning." Daniel pulled the empty chair closer to the bed. "I will stay." Outside, rain moved softly against the hospital window. Inside, the letter lay open at last, and for the first time in 8 years, Daniel did not turn away from what it asked him to carry. Morning arrived slowly through the hospital blinds, turning the room pale gold. Daniel had not slept. He sat beside Ethan's bed with Michael's letter folded in his hands, while Sadie rested beneath the chair, one ear lifting whenever the boy shifted. Laura had dozed for less than an hour with her coat folded beneath her head. When the nurse entered to check Ethan's breathing, the numbers were steady. The tightness in his chest had eased, and color had returned to his face. "You are doing well," she told him. Ethan looked toward Sadie. "She did most of it." The nurse smiled. "Then she deserves breakfast too." Daniel stepped into the hallway and returned with water for Sadie and coffee for Laura. Outside the room, Officer Rachel Monroe waited with a folder tucked beneath one arm. "We checked the bus station cameras," she said. "Ethan and Sadie arrived at 7:12 yesterday morning. From there, they walked nearly a mile in the rain." Daniel looked through the doorway at the boy. "He should never have made it that far." Rachel nodded. "He did because the dog stayed with him." She opened the folder. Photographs showed the alley, the empty row house, and the marks the blanket had left across the wet ground. "We reconstructed what happened." Ethan entered the house when his breathing worsened. Sadie stayed with him until he could no longer stand. Then she went to the laundromat, pulled the blanket from the donation cart, and brought it back. Daniel studied the marks. She wrapped him in it, as best as a dog could. She pulled one side over him, circled, pulled again, then dragged the loose end toward the street. Rachel paused. "From the house to your shop is almost half a mile." Daniel looked at Sadie. Her paws were clean now, but the pads were still tender from pavement and cold water. She had built a rescue from instinct, memory, and whatever objects the city had left within reach. No command, no training exercise, just refusal. Rachel continued. She stopped at 3 places where people were present. The laundromat, a corner market, then your shop. Daniel understood. She was searching for someone who would follow. "And you did." He glanced at Michael's letter. "Eventually." Later that morning, Ethan sat upright while Daniel helped him eat toast. Laura completed discharge forms at the desk. Sadie remained close enough that her shoulder touched the bed frame. "Did Dad really tell you to teach me how to change a tire?" Ethan asked. Daniel looked at him. "He did. Can you?" "Yes." "Today?" Laura turned from the desk. "Not today." Ethan sighed, and for the first time, the room felt almost ordinary. Daniel smiled. Soon, when the doctor cleared Ethan to leave the following afternoon, the rain had stopped. The city looked washed clean beneath a bright blue sky. Daniel drove Laura and Ethan back to Market Street because Ethan wanted to see where Sadie had found him help. The blanket had been cleaned by the laundromat staff and folded neatly on a chair outside Daniel's shop. The woman with the red umbrella was there. Louise stood near the bay door. Several store owners had gathered, but no one crowded the family. They simply made space. Ethan stepped from the truck with Sadie beside him. The street grew quiet again, though this time the silence held relief. The laundromat employee carried the folded blanket forward. "I thought you might want this." Ethan touched the soft gray fabric. Sadie sniffed it once, then looked at Daniel. Daniel lifted the blanket and placed it over his arm. "We will keep it," he said. Laura watched him carefully. "Why?" Daniel looked at Ethan, then at the dog who had carried more than anyone knew. "Because it reminds me that help does not always arrive with a siren. Sometimes it arrives tired, soaked, and unwilling to leave." Sadie leaned against Ethan's leg. Around them, Market Street began moving again, but more gently than before. 3 weeks later, Daniel cleared the passenger side of his workbench and placed a small red toolbox there for Ethan. The boy arrived every Saturday morning with Laura and Sadie, always 10 minutes early, always carrying the gray blanket folded beneath one arm. At first, the visits were quiet. Laura sat in the office with coffee while Ethan learned the names of tools, and Daniel showed him how to check tire pressure, tighten a loose battery terminal, and listen for the difference between a harmless rattle and a warning. Sadie lay near the open garage bay, watching every movement with the same patient focus she had shown in the rain. Market Street had returned to its usual noise, but something had changed. Drivers slowed near the laundromat. Store owners kept bowls of water outside. The woman with the red umbrella had placed a small sign in her window asking people to notice animals that seemed to be leading rather than wandering. No one called Sadie a hero in front of Daniel. The word felt too simple for what she had done. She had not performed for applause. She had solved one problem at a time because Ethan needed her to. One Saturday, Laura brought a cardboard box from Jacksonville. Inside were photographs, old Marine Corps letters, and a worn baseball glove that had belonged to Michael. Daniel opened the box slowly. The smell of paper, leather, and cedar carried him backward before he was ready. Ethan stood beside him. "Mom said you might know where some of this came from." Daniel lifted a photograph of himself and Michael beside a dusty vehicle, both younger, both smiling as if time were endless. Your father took this after we fixed a transmission with half the tools we needed. Ethan studied the picture. Was he good at fixing things? Daniel smiled. He was good at convincing other people they could. The boy looked down at the red toolbox. Like you. Daniel did not answer immediately. Across the garage, Sadie raised her head. Laura watched from the office doorway. I am trying, Daniel said. Later, while Ethan practiced changing a tire on an old training wheel, Sadie rose and walked toward the sidewalk. She stopped near the place where she had once dropped the blanket in the rain. Daniel followed. A young mother stood there with a stroller, struggling to calm a crying toddler while holding 2 grocery bags. One bag had torn, sending Kins rolling toward the curb. Sadie picked up a soft package of diapers in her mouth and carried it back to the woman. The mother laughed through her frustration. Daniel gathered the cans. Ethan brought the empty bag from the shop. For several minutes, strangers helped one another without asking who owed what. When the woman left, Ethan looked at Sadie. She always notices first. Daniel looked down the street. Maybe she just does not ignore what she sees. That evening, Laura invited Daniel to dinner at their temporary apartment near the river. He almost declined out of habit. The excuse formed easily. Work. Paperwork. An early morning. Then Sadie stood beside the truck with the gray blanket in her mouth and looked at him. Daniel laughed softly. All right. I understand. At the apartment, Ethan placed Michael's dog tag in a small wooden frame beside the family photograph. Laura served soup and warm bread. No one tried to recreate the years that had been lost. They spoke about school, rent, a possible job for Laura in Wilmington, and whether Sadie should be allowed on the couch. Sadie answered that question herself by resting her head across Daniel's knee. After dinner, Ethan brought out the unopened envelope he had mailed weeks earlier. You still have not read this one, he said. Daniel opened it at the table. Inside was a single page written in the boy's careful handwriting. I do not need you to replace my dad. I just want to know the person he trusted. Daniel read the sentence twice. Then he folded the letter and placed it beside Michael's. You do now, he said. Ethan looked at him. Will you still come next Saturday? Daniel glanced at Sadie, then at Laura, then at the gray blanket folded over the back of a chair. Yes, he said. And the Saturday after that. Outside, the river reflected the city lights. Inside, no one spoke for a while. The silence was no longer empty. It was holding them together. By early summer, Laura had accepted a position at a small dental office near downtown Wilmington, and the apartment by the river no longer felt temporary. Ethan finished the school year with a science project about working dogs, though he refused to call Sadie trained. She just knows when someone needs her, he told his teacher. Every Saturday, he still arrived at Daniel's shop with the red toolbox, and every Saturday, Daniel found another reason to keep him a little longer. They changed brake pads, cleaned spark plugs, and repaired an old bicycle that Ethan planned to ride to school. Laura often joined them for lunch beneath the shop awning, where Market Street moved in sunlight instead of rain. Sadie rested nearby, her black and tan coat bright, her amber eyes following every person who passed. The gray blanket remained folded on a shelf inside the office. Daniel had washed it twice, but one corner still carried a faint stain from the wet street. He could have thrown it away. He never did. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan found him standing beside the shelf with Michael's letter in one hand and the blanket in the other. Why do you keep both? The boy asked. Daniel looked toward the open garage bay. Laura was speaking with Luis near the sidewalk. Sadie lay in a square of sunlight, one paw resting over the edge of Ethan's small toolbox. Because one reminded me what I promised, Daniel said, and the other reminded me it was not too late. Ethan considered that. Dad carried you once. Daniel nodded slowly. More than once. Sadie carried me. Yes. Ethan touched the folded blanket. Who carried her? Daniel looked at the German shepherd. Maybe she was not waiting to be carried. He paused. Maybe she was waiting for someone to see how tired she was. That evening, Daniel closed the shop early. Laura had invited him to dinner at the new house she was renting near Greenfield Lake, a small place with a fenced yard and a porch wide enough for 3 chairs. He arrived carrying groceries in one arm and the gray blanket in the other. Ethan opened the door before he knocked. You brought it. Daniel stepped inside. It belongs with the family. Laura stood in the kitchen, watching him with a quiet expression that no longer held caution. Sadie approached, sniffed the blanket once, then walked toward the living room. Daniel followed and placed it across the back of the couch beneath the framed photograph of Michael, Laura, Ethan, and a younger Sadie. Michael's dog tag hung beside it. Nothing in the room tried to erase him. Nothing asked Daniel to become him. The past had finally found a place where it could be remembered without keeping everyone outside. After dinner, Ethan carried the repaired bicycle onto the driveway. Daniel adjusted the seat while Laura stood near the porch steps. "Ready?" Daniel asked. Ethan nodded, though his hands tightened around the handlebars. Sadie trotted beside him as he pushed off. The first few feet were uneven. Daniel kept one hand behind the seat. "Do not let go," Ethan called. "I am here." They reached the end of the driveway. Daniel loosened his grip, but stayed close. Ethan pedaled forward with Sadie running beside him, steady and alert. When the boy turned at the sidewalk, he realized Daniel was no longer holding the bicycle. For one startled second, he wobbled. Then he found his balance. Laura laughed softly. Daniel watched Ethan ride beneath the warm evening light, with Sadie matching every turn. Michael had asked him to stay close, not to take anyone's place, but to make sure no one stood alone. Daniel had once believed promises were measured by the moment they were made. Now he understood they were measured by the days that followed. Later, the three of them sat on the porch while Sadie rested across Daniel's boots. The front door remained open behind them, and the gray blanket was visible inside, no longer soaked, no longer dragging across pavement, no longer carrying anyone through the rain. Ethan leaned against the railing. Why did the whole street get quiet that day? Daniel looked at Sadie, then at the people beside him. Because everyone finally understood what she had been trying to say. The dog lifted her head at the sound of his voice. Daniel rested one hand against her shoulder. Some lives are saved by strength, some by timing, and some by a tired dog who refuses to stop until the right person finally pays attention.